not sure how this is evidence of anything. Those are images of Tanwet Amani's tomb, and that's the 25th dynasty started by Taharqa. Are you really that weak? Obviously my point is the 25th dynasty. So I made a mistake and I mentioned Taharqa instead of his father Pie. Are you really that pathetic that you're going to harp on the fact that I chose one generation over another when we're talking about dynasties? The point still remains. Nubians have art that looks like Egyptian art because they were influenced by over 24 dynasties of Egyptian culture. That was
Ancient Egypt was in Africa. Its culture began in southern Egypt.
I don't even recall making any reference to a history dealing with this. I thought it was artistical singularity.
Talk about the pot calling the kettle black. You might have been talking about artistic similarities. I was the one who stated that I wasn't sure what your point was.
Won't be naming no buildings after me to go down dilapidated. No, you won't be naming no buildings after me. My name will be mistaken.
The fact of the matter is those artistic similarities only exist because you're talking about the 25th dynasty. If you're going to make a point about them being related, at least use an early dynasty.
The 25th dynasty represents a point in time in ancient Egyptian history when Egypt had fallen on hard times, had been ruled by various warlords and small chiefs in various villages in the north of Egypt primarily. And so it was Kushite kings from Kush, south of Egypt, and now modern-day Sudan, who rallied their forces and came into ancient Egypt to drive out the invaders and to do what they specifically said was to restore the land of their ancestors. And so that first effort to restore Egypt was led by Pianke, and he drove out the invaders, established a stable government, and then returned home to Kush to live out the rest of his life. Unfortunately, the invaders from the north came back in and took control of the nation. So Pianke's brother, Shabaka, rallied his forces and came in and totally obliterated the competition. And what Shabaka did was to not only restore the temples and monuments of their ancestors, and when I speak of their ancestors, we're talking specifically about their ancestors who lived 2,000 years earlier, the pyramid builders of the 4th, of the 5th, and 6th dynasties. These were their ancestors that they were talking about. And one of the most important things that Shabaka did was to rewrite a text which he said was worm-eaten. It was a text that was in a library that had not been maintained because of the political instability. And that text was carved by scribes on stone so that it would endure forever. That text now hangs in the British Museum, and it's called the Shabaka Stone. This is the oldest and most complete treatise on Genesis ever written. And it is a profound spiritual story about the creation of the world as viewed through the eyes of ancient Africans. A profound text.
You're claiming I'm putting words in your mouth? Come on now. I'll wait for you to show any video of mine where I claim that Egypt was biracial. I'll wait for you to show any video of mine that shows that I believe in race in the first place. What I have stated, and that's the same thing that Shamarka stated, Egypt was at a crossroads, and it had people who migrated originally from the Sahara. But you also had later migrations from the Sudan, from Palestine. You had migrations even from northern Africa in the form of the Berbers. And as it was this crossroad, it had people who were migrating from different latitudes and had different looks. Much the same way Arabia also has different looks and different latitudes. People from Yemen are darker than people from Palestine. That's just the way it is.
The last picture I'm going to show is a very abstract picture which I cannot possibly explain to you correctly. It's an attempt to summarize everything we know about gene frequency differences all in one number. It's called a principal component, and maybe a few of you like Leo Goodman know what that means, but I'm not going to try to explain it. It's a way of combining the numbers from all the different genes in an optimal way. And what this shows is the value, roughly speaking, of that principal component of human variation in Africa, Europe, coming across Europe this way, getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and being smallest in Asia. That's the so-called first principal component. And what it reveals is the big picture of migration in the Eastern Hemisphere. Well, in the world, in fact. You had a northward spread from Africa into Europe, so the European gene frequencies in their principal component are most like Africa. I know that'll be very alarming to some Europeans, but there it is. The Slavs are somewhat less Africanized, and then when you get into Central Asia, it changes somewhat. When you get into Central Asia, it moves again. Australian Aborigines are off by themselves, and then these Asians, these Siberians, moved into the New World.
How far away is Africa from the Americas? And there's no evidence of any type of architecture similar to the Olmec
Going back
in
before
West Africa.
3000 BC, nowhere in the world did anybody, even the world, paint a picture of a boat with a sail on it. Here's 3000 BC, a boat with a sail on it in Nubia, not in Egypt.
Even some cultures came from the other side of the ocean. Some cultures were here already, like the Olmecs. And they are considered probably the roots of the Africans because of the negroid features on their big heads that were left around. And actually in the Pacific coast of Guatemala we have a city known as Abactacalic or Tacalicabaj, and actually it's sort of the link between the Mayas and the Olmecs. The Mayan civilization is sort of a overlapping of cultures.
55% European, 32% Native American, 9% East Asian, and 4% Sub-Saharan African.
I gotta put down black.
Right, Mr. Muhammad Arabi, the Birdman of Aswan. I promise, if I want to find out about birds, I'll use him. But thanks for showing me your total ignorance about Egypt if you don't know that Aswan is a part of Nubia, as Nubia got divided into two. Northern Nubia is in Egypt, southern Nubia is in the Sudan. And your Birdman, your local expert guide on birds from Nubia, should stick to topics he knows, because he obviously doesn't have a clue just because he's born in Nubia.
This is a particular haplotype. We can talk about it later. But if you look at Egypt, Lebanon, Palestine, Iraq, Egypt, and Libya, you just need to know that this 4, 5, and 11 are haplotypes that are common in Northeast Africa and other parts of Africa. You see a certain percentage in Egypt, but the 7 and 8 are more common, as you see in Lebanon, Palestine, and Iraq.
For example, we can bring up his article, Genetics, Egypt, and History, Interpreting Geographical Patterns of Y Chromosome Variation. Now, Muhammad Arabi claims that Southern Egypt or Upper Egypt did not get admixture. Funny, I'm looking here, and you've got the typical African ones, which by the way are shared by groups like the Berbers in 4, 5, and 11, or for you non-Roman numeral reading, IV, V, and XI. But you also see 7, 8, and 15. Again, for you non-Roman numeral reading people, that's VII, VIII, and XV. Now if we scroll to the bottom, what is the first thing we notice about those haplotypes? It says haplotypes 7 and 8 are most prevalent in the Near East, and 12 and 15 in Europe. So you have 7, 8, and 15, which are non-African haplotypes. But the Birdman said there was no admixture. So let me calculate this. You have 4.6 of haplotype 7, you have 3% of haplotype 8, and 6.1% of haplotype 15. That's almost 14% of their ancestry, which is of haplotypes not typical of Africa. That's more than the European ancestry in African Americans. But they're not mixed, right? Yeah, when I want to know about birds, I'll go for your Mr. Muhammad Arabi. When I want to know about genetics and populations, I'll go with Dr. Shamar Keita. You're claiming I'm putting words in your mouth? Come on now. I'll wait for you to show any video of mine where I claim that Egypt was biracial. I'll wait for you to show any video of mine that shows that I believe in race in the first place.
I can tell you that recently you can find in the genetics literature very interesting claims based on some very old books. For example, a few years ago, an article was written about Senegambia, mitochondrial DNA, in which it was stated that the Fulani, the Fulbe, who are an African people who were found from Senegal to basically Eritrea today, so across the Sahel belt, that they're descendants of the Hyksos. Now, this is from some old books that they got someplace. They clearly didn't read modern linguistics. They clearly didn't talk to modern Africanists. They didn't do it. They got published in the American Journal of Human Genetics. And what happened? You say, well, how did this happen? It happened because the people doing genetics, the editors of those journals, are more concerned about the techniques of genetics. And they just assume that the quote soft part, they got that right. But they don't give those articles to other people to referee equally strong, because they don't think that what Africanists have to say is important and what African linguists have to say is important. This is a very harsh judgment on my part. Some of this has changed, but I have the hard evidence that this is true. I have the hard evidence that this is true.
This moron just doesn't get it. First, Shamarka stating that a Eurasian gene, a gene that was assumed to be Eurasian, that supposedly was a Hyksos gene, was spread all over the Sahel. Fact of the matter is, Egyptians really didn't depict the Hyksos as that different anyway. As far as your stupid claim that I don't listen to Africanists, no, I do listen to Africanists. I ignore Afrocentrists like you. Contrary to you, I actually talk to scientists, like Dr. Keita.
Hello?
Hello, Dr. Keita?
Oh, good afternoon to you. How are you doing?
All right. Now, one thing I wasn't sure, because at one point in time I was watching your videos, and you said that you believe that even, 20,000 years ago, you think that lighter-skinned, straight-haired people were already in Africa?
Always been people who were lighter skinned and straighter hair from 60,000 years ago. Always. They're not new. That's my whole point. In fact, I could make the argument that those kinds of characteristics actually originated in Africa, that they didn't come from someplace else. They're part of modern humanity, or they're part of humanity. And there's no reason to believe that they could not have originated in Africa.
How are you doing?
All right. Now, one thing I wasn't sure, because at one point in time I was watching your videos, and you said that you believe that even, 20,000 years ago, you think that lighter-skinned, straight-haired people were already in Africa?
Yeah, well, my own belief on this is that, number one, we don't know. Okay, number one, I'm agnostic. Number two, I've always made the point of saying that if modern people actually emerged 150,000 years ago in Africa,
I've always been people who were lighter skinned and straighter haired from 60,000 years ago. Always. They're not new. That's my whole point. In fact, I could make the argument that those kinds of characteristics actually originated in Africa. That they didn't come from someplace else. They're part of modern humanity, or they're part of humanity. And there's no reason to believe that they could not have originated in Africa. I've always been people who were lighter skinned and straighter haired from 60,000 years ago. Always. They're not new. That's my whole point. In fact, I could make the argument that those kinds of characteristics actually originated in Africa. That they didn't come from someplace else. They're part of modern humanity, or they're part of humanity. And there's no reason to believe that they could not have originated in Africa. Or they're part of humanity. And there's no reason to believe that they could not have originated in Africa.
Seen at 4,000 frames per second, the slap seems to dislodge the brainiac's face. When the cheek is struck, a shockwave travels through the skin's collagen, arriving at the opposite cheek almost instantaneously.